When the world watched in March 2003, the sky over Baghdad lit up with explosions and the thunder of missiles. The United States and its allies had launched a full-scale invasion of Iraq, a nation accused of hiding weapons of mass destruction. The promise was bold: to eliminate a global threat, to free a people, and to make the world safer. But what unfolded was a war that would instead fracture alliances, sow chaos, and permanently erode global faith in American leadership. The story of the Iraq War begins long before the first bombs fell. It starts in the ashes of the September 11th attacks, when fear, anger, and uncertainty consumed the United States. The Bush administration, determined to prevent another catastrophe, turned its gaze toward the Middle East. Afghanistan had already fallen. The Taliban was toppled, but President George W. Bush and his advisors believed that the threat ran deeper and that Saddam Hussein's Iraq might be the next ticking time bomb. Saddam had long been an enemy of the West. He was a dictator who had waged war against Iran, invaded Kuwait, and gassed his own people. In Washington's eyes, he was the embodiment of evil. But what pushed Iraq back into America's crosshairs were allegations that Saddam still possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, perhaps even nuclear. The claim was that Iraq's hidden stockpiles violated United Nations resolutions and posed an imminent danger to global security. The evidence, however, was shaky. Intelligence reports were often based on unverified sources, assumptions, and worst-case scenarios. Still, the White House pressed forward. In speeches, press briefings, and diplomatic meetings, the case for war was built piece by piece. The U.S. Secretary of State, Colin Powell, stood before the United Nations in February 2003, holding up a small vial as a symbol of potential anthrax. He declared that Iraq's defiance could not go unanswered. Many around the world watched in disbelief, but also in fear. Could Iraq truly have such weapons? And if it did, could the world afford to wait? Behind the scenes, the decision to go to war was not just about weapons. It was about reshaping the Middle East, spreading democracy, and demonstrating American power. Neoconservative figures within the administration, like Donald Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz, believed that toppling Saddam would ignite a democratic wave across the region. Iraq, they said, would become a model for freedom, but not everyone agreed. Major allies like France and Germany warned against rushing into war without conclusive evidence. Millions of protesters around the world filled the streets, chanting "No war in Iraq." It became one of the largest global protests in history. Despite the opposition, on March 20, 2003, the invasion began. Operation Iraqi Freedom was underway. In the opening hours, the U.S. military unleashed its shock and awe campaign, a relentless bombardment meant to cripple Iraq's defenses and break its will to fight. Within weeks, Baghdad fell. Television screens showed jubilant Iraqis tearing down statues of Saddam Hussein. For a brief moment, it seemed that the mission was accomplished. President Bush even stood aboard the aircraft carrier USS Abraham Lincoln beneath a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." But the mission was far from over. As the months passed, the truth began to unravel. No weapons of mass destruction were found, no chemical weapons, no biological labs, no nuclear program. The central justification for the war had collapsed. It was a devastating blow to America's credibility. Allies felt betrayed. Even within the United States, the public began to question everything it had been told. How could the world's most powerful intelligence agencies have been so wrong? Or worse, had they lied? Meanwhile, Iraq itself descended into chaos. With Saddam's regime gone, the fragile balance of power shattered. Sunni, Shia, and Kurdish factions vied for control. Insurgents rose from the ruins, targeting American troops and Iraqi civilians alike. Al-Qaeda in Iraq emerged, planting the seeds for what would later become ISIS, Car bombs ripped through marketplaces. Sectarian killings turned neighborhoods into battlegrounds. What was promised as liberation quickly transformed into occupation and civil war. The human cost was staggering. Over 4,000 American soldiers were killed. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis lost their lives. Millions were displaced, their homes destroyed, their futures stolen. Photos from Abu Ghraib prison revealed U.S. soldiers abusing detainees, further fueling anti-American sentiment. The moral high ground the U.S. had claimed at the war's start crumbled under the weight of scandal and suffering. Internationally, the Iraq War fractured trust between nations. It deepened divisions within the United Nations. It fueled anti-Western resentment across the Arab world. And it emboldened adversaries who saw America as reckless and overstretched. The war that was meant to make the world safer had, paradoxically, made it more volatile. In Washington, the political fallout was immense. The Bush administration faced intense scrutiny. Intelligence failures were dissected in congressional hearings. Officials defended their actions by arguing that Saddam's past behavior justified preemptive action, but the damage was done. The narrative of American deceit took root. Weapons of mass destruction became a symbol of government manipulation and media complacency. The legacy of the Iraq War extended far beyond its official end in 2011. Iraq's democracy struggled to take hold. Corruption ran rampant. Militias filled the power vacuum left by departing U.S. forces. And in the chaos, ISIS rose, capturing vast territories and reigniting global terrorism. In many ways, the invasion that was supposed to end tyranny had unleashed new horrors. For many Americans, the war left a deep psychological scar. Trust in government plummeted. The media, which had largely echoed the administration's claims, faced a crisis of credibility. The phrase, fake news, would not emerge until years later, but the seeds of distrust were planted here, in the fog of Iraq. Historians now view the Iraq War as a turning point. It redefined how nations think about intervention, intelligence, and truth itself. It taught the world that even the mightiest military power can be ensnared by its own ambitions and blind spots. And it showed that wars fought in the name of freedom can, if built on falsehoods, destroy the very ideals they claim to protect. As the smoke cleared and the years passed, one truth remained undeniable. The Iraq War was not just a military conflict, it was a moral and political reckoning. It shattered the illusion of infallibility. It exposed the fragility of global trust. And it reminded the world that once credibility is lost, it can take generations to rebuild. Even today, 2 decades later, the echoes of that war persist. In the ruins of Mosul, in the refugee camps, in the debates of diplomats and veterans' memories, the question lingers: was it worth it? The answer depends on whom you ask, but for much of the world, the Iraq War stands as a cautionary tale of power unchecked, truth compromised, and trust forever broken. For those who lived through it, the Iraq War was more than headlines and political speeches. It was the sound of air raid sirens piercing the night. It was the fear etched on a mother's face as she shielded her children from falling debris. It was the sight of young soldiers thousands of miles from home, uncertain of what they were truly fighting for. Every war leaves scars, but Iraq's were especially deep, because beyond the bombings and battles, it represented a betrayal of belief. The belief that the world's most powerful democracies would always act with integrity. The belief that truth would triumph over propaganda. When those beliefs collapsed, the consequences rippled far beyond Iraq's borders. The Middle East, already unstable, was thrust into greater turmoil. Iran's influence grew as Iraq's government fractured along sectarian lines. Regional balance shifted. Old rivalries reignited. In many ways, the Iraq invasion redrew the political map of the Middle East. It created the very instability it was meant to eliminate. The war also reshaped the global perception of the United States. For decades, America had been seen, rightly or wrongly, as a beacon of freedom. But the images from Iraq told a different story. Prisoners hooded and humiliated, civilians caught in crossfire, officials insisting that democracy could be delivered at gunpoint. For much of the world, the U.S. no longer looked like a liberator, but an occupier. And then there were the veterans. Hundreds of thousands of men and women who served in Iraq returned home forever changed. Many bore visible wounds. Others carried invisible ones, trauma, guilt, and disillusionment. They had entered a war that began with certainty and ended with doubt. A war where victory was declared, but peace was never achieved. Among Iraqis, the feelings were equally complex. Some had initially welcomed the fall of Saddam Hussein, hoping for a new era of freedom. But as years of violence dragged on, optimism faded. Electricity remained scarce. Basic services crumbled. Militias replaced police. What was meant to be liberation became survival. By 2006, Iraq had descended into near civil war. Sunni and Shia militias clashed brutally, and entire neighborhoods were ethnically cleansed. The U.S. found itself trapped in a quagmire, caught between factions it barely understood. In response, Washington launched a troop surge in 2007 under General David Petraeus. The strategy reduced violence temporarily, but it was a bandage on a deep wound. The core problem remained unsolved. Iraq was broken from within. When U.S. forces finally withdrew in 2011, there was no victory parade, just a quiet, uneasy exit. America's longest war at the time had left behind a country still bleeding. Into that vacuum stepped ISIS. The militant group exploited Iraq's chaos to build a brutal caliphate that would terrorize the world for years to come. Thus, the Iraq War's consequences did not end, they evolved. Politically, the war became a stain on the Bush presidency. It haunted the administrations that followed. It shaped how the world viewed future conflicts in Syria, in Libya, and beyond. Every time Western leaders considered intervention, the specter of Iraq loomed. Another Iraq became shorthand for disaster. The phrase, weapons of mass destruction, turned into a punchline, a grim reminder of the lies that led to war. For journalists and citizens alike, the Iraq War changed the relationship between truth and power. It exposed how narratives could be manufactured and sold, how governments could manipulate fear, how the media, rather than questioning, could amplify deception. The war didn't just destroy cities, it dismantled trust. Yet, amid the devastation, lessons emerged. The importance of skepticism, the cost of hubris, the need for accountability. Historians, scholars, and veterans continue to debate what could have been done differently. Some argue the war was inevitable given the post-9/11 paranoia. Others insist it was a choice that could and should have been avoided. 2 decades later, the Iraq War remains one of the most controversial episodes in modern history. It's taught in classrooms, dissected in documentaries, and revisited in every political scandal involving intelligence or intervention. Its ghosts linger in policy debates, in public distrust, in the unhealed wounds of those who lived through it. But perhaps the most haunting legacy is the silence of those who can no longer speak, the civilians whose names were never recorded, the soldiers who never came home, the leaders who never truly apologized. Their absence is the loudest testimony of all. When historians look back, they won't just see a war, they'll see a warning about what happens when fear replaces facts, when ambition overrides ethics, and when trust, once broken, becomes the greatest casualty of all. In the end, the Iraq War was not simply a battle for territory or power. It was a battle for truth, and truth, as the world learned, was the first thing to fall. The story of the Iraq War did not end with the withdrawal of U.S. troops or the fall of ISIS's caliphate. Its consequences continued to echo across generations, shaping not only Iraq but also the very soul of American foreign policy. In many ways, the invasion became a mirror, reflecting the limits of power and the dangers of conviction untempered by doubt. In the years following the war, Iraq struggled to rebuild, but reconstruction proved far more difficult than destruction. Billions of dollars in aid and contracts flowed into the country, yet much of it disappeared into corruption and mismanagement. Entire neighborhoods of Baghdad still lacked basic infrastructure, while foreign companies profited from reconstruction deals that rarely reached ordinary citizens. The promise of democracy was undermined by the grim reality of graft and political infighting. Elections were held, but they often deepened sectarian divisions instead of healing them. Each ballot box became a reminder of how fragile Iraq's unity truly was. Meanwhile, Iran quietly expanded its influence within Iraq's borders. Through proxies, militias, and political alliances, Tehran filled the vacuum left by America's retreat. It funded and armed groups that later became part of Iraq's security apparatus, blurring the line between state and militia. For Washington, this was an unintended irony. The war meant to weaken a hostile regime had strengthened another. The effects of the war also rippled through the Western world. In Britain, Prime Minister Tony Blair's legacy was forever tarnished by his role in supporting the invasion. The dodgy dossier, the intelligence report used to justify the war, was exposed as deeply flawed. Public trust in British institutions plummeted, and the war haunted every political debate for a decade. In America, similar wounds festered. The Senate Intelligence Committee eventually concluded that the intelligence about weapons of mass destruction was exaggerated and misleading. But by then, the damage to Iraq, to global trust, and to America's moral authority was irreversible. For journalists and historians, the war became a study in how information could be manipulated to serve ideology. In the early 2000s, the mainstream media largely echoed government narratives, failing to question their validity. Headlines about aluminum tubes and secret labs dominated front pages, while dissenting voices were marginalized. Only after the invasion did major outlets begin to admit their failures. This reckoning reshaped journalism itself, giving rise to a more skeptical press and the independent media movement that thrives today. The war also transformed military strategy. It revealed the limits of high-tech warfare in the face of guerrilla resistance. The shock and awe campaign had toppled a regime, but it could not win hearts and minds. The Pentagon learned, at a terrible cost, that victory required more than firepower. It required understanding. Counterinsurgency operations, once an afterthought, became the new doctrine. Yet even with adaptation, the question lingered: can occupation ever bring peace? Culturally, Iraq's trauma became the world's cautionary tale. Films, novels, and documentaries began dissecting the conflict from every angle. The soldiers' experience, the civilian suffering, the deception behind the war. In classrooms, the Iraq War joined Vietnam as a case study in overreach. Students debated ethics, power, and truth, often asking the same haunting question: how could so many intelligent people be so wrong? Inside Iraq, generations grew up knowing only conflict. Children born after 2003 came of age in a nation defined by checkpoints, militias, and uncertainty. They inherited a country where hope was a luxury and peace a distant dream. For many Iraqis, the psychological scars were as deep as the physical ones. Trust in institutions collapsed. Neighbors viewed each other with suspicion. What once was a proud civilization, the cradle of Mesopotamia, became synonymous with war and loss. And yet, amid the wreckage, small sparks of resilience endured. Artists painted murals on the ruins. Students returned to school despite daily threats. Communities rebuilt homes brick by brick, determined not to let their country vanish into memory. This quiet defiance, unseen by cameras, became Iraq's truest form of resistance. For the United States, the Iraq War forced a reckoning with its role in the world. The era of unquestioned interventionism came to an end. The public's appetite for war evaporated, shaping the foreign policy of future presidents. Barack Obama's cautious approach, Donald Trump's withdrawal rhetoric, and Joe Biden's emphasis on diplomacy, all were shaped by the shadow of Iraq. The invasion taught Washington that even a superpower could bleed, and it reminded Americans that the cost of hubris is measured not just in dollars, but in credibility. Globally, the Iraq War shifted the balance of power. As the U.S. became mired in the Middle East, rivals like China and Russia capitalized on the distraction. They expanded their influence, filled diplomatic voids, and began challenging the Western order the U.S. once dominated. In this sense, Iraq was not only America's war, it was the moment the unipolar world began to fracture. The echoes of that fracture continue to shape international politics today. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, many in the global South remembered the Iraq War. They saw echoes of hypocrisy in Western condemnations of aggression. How, they asked, can the nations that invaded Iraq now speak of sovereignty and international law? It was a painful reminder that moral authority, once lost, is hard to regain. Back in Iraq, progress remains uneven. Some cities have rebuilt, others remain in ruins. Oil wealth still fuels corruption rather than prosperity. Many Iraqis continue to leave, searching for safety and stability abroad. But others stay, driven by a fierce sense of belonging. They are the generation that knows the cost of war and the price of peace. In the end, the Iraq War is more than a historical event. It is a living memory, a warning etched into the conscience of humanity. It reminds us that truth can be weaponized, that fear can be engineered, and that trust, once betrayed, is almost impossible to restore. It asks every leader, every journalist, and every citizen to remember what happens when power silences doubt. The invasion that promised liberation left behind ashes. The war that sought to secure peace ignited decades of instability. And the nation that vowed to defend truth taught the world how fragile truth can be. History will continue to debate the Iraq War's intentions and outcomes. But one lesson stands above all others. In the pursuit of justice, there can be no shortcuts through deception. Because when trust is shattered, no amount of victory can rebuild it.